You. Yes, I'm addressing you directly, and I'll start with a simple statement. You live in a virtual reality because all the sensations you experience from birth to death are created by your brain. The brain constructs an internal virtual environment that either perfectly mirrors the external world or doesn't. How can you tell if something is wrong with the reality you perceive? Could there be anomalies in the world? The first idea that would likely come into someone's mind today is that I'm describing a simulated reality, but it's much more complicated. Most people who believe in the simulation hypothesis imagine the external world in a very specific way. I draw this conclusion because the most popular work on this topic is Nick Bostrom's article titled "Are you living in a computer simulation?" In short, Bostrom's argument goes like this. One day, humanity will be able to create countless simulations of the universe, indistinguishable from the original. Within these simulations, people will emerge who will also create their own simulations, and so on ad infinitum. Damn, the probability that we are at the beginning of this chain approaches zero. As you can see, it doesn't sound particularly convincing. But after Elon Musk echoed this argument, many people's minds were blown. However, if anyone were in Elon Musk's place, they would also conclude that they live in a simulation. The point is that in the mind of an average person who believes in the simulation hypothesis, the real world outside the simulation is the same world in terms of physical laws. And here's where things get interesting. Because in the world as you know it, there is at least one anomaly that, firstly, cannot be explained by the known laws of the universe, and secondly, it's unclear what laws could even explain it. Imagine your memory is erased and you are plugged into a simulation within incorrect physical laws. What could you learn about the external reality? At first glance, nothing. But that's not true. After studying the properties of the program governing your perception and understanding the laws it operates by, you won't stop there. No, you'll try to explain the origin and properties of the objects observed in your reality, including yourself. Ultimately, you'd conclude that no complete explanation exists. You'd realize that the very fact of your existence cannot be derived from the laws of the world you're in. Here is a simpler example. Imagine you are in a first-person chess game as a king. First, you study the physical laws of this environment and their consequences. For instance, that the knight moves in a L shape and can't jump over other pieces. Or that a position with 9 white or black pawns is impossible. After studying all the laws of the chess world, you'd conclude that they're too simple to give rise to intelligence. Thus, you could infer that your own thought processes couldn't have emerged in the universe you find yourself in. The more sophisticated the simulation, the longer you'd remain under the illusion of its reality. If your jailers want you to never realize you're in a simulation, it's not enough to simply shield you from the external world. The simulation must be entirely self-sufficient and self-consistent in every aspect. The answer to every question you have about the world must be woven into the fabric of the simulated reality. This is the essence of the so-called principle of causal closure of the physical world. According to this principle, every physical effect has a sufficient physical cause. The universe contains everything necessary to fully explain any of its elements, and enclosed in the sense that no non-physical causes are required for such explanations. Despite the principle of causal closure being a foundational concept in physics, many thinkers doubt that even a part of reality is causally closed, let alone the entirety of it. Doubts. Doubts led Newton to the law of universal gravitation and Einstein to the theory of relativity. Doubts will likely lead humanity to the theory of quantum gravity, but they also give rise to flat earth theories and reptilian conspiracies. Human doubt has no bounds. You can doubt global warming, the existence of a spoon, or even ancient Rome. You can doubt the moon landing, whether 2 plus 2 equal 4, or even the existence of your own body. But one thing you cannot doubt is that You are dubbing. I dub, therefore I think, and therefore I exist. These words are often attributed to René Descartes, but Descartes himself didn't want this statement to sound like a logical conclusion. In his meditation on first philosophy, he insisted on a simple formulation: I exist. This statement is self-evident, requires no justification, and is an axiom. Many believe that modern science began with Descartes, with his principle of starting from the indubitable, that which cannot be contradicted. So you can believe that the world is an illusion, that everything is a simulation, or that you are brain in a wet. Some of this might be true, or maybe all of it. You will never know with absolute certainty. But what you do know for sure is that you're aware of your own existence. Consciousness. Many think that talking about consciousness in scientific circles is frowned upon, but that's far from the truth. Max Planck once said, I regard consciousness as a fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. Consciousness is a term that encompasses many different things. Type consciousness into a YouTube search bar and you will find hundreds of thousands of marquee videos. As you can see, I've decided to add one more. In some videos, you'll hear about the immortal soul, in others, about neurophysiological processes. Some will claim that consciousness has nothing to do with the soul or the brain, while others will argue that consciousness doesn't exist at all. This diversity stems from humanity's weak understanding of what we call consciousness. After centuries, there is still no universally accepted definition. Of course, most people intuitively understand what it means. Consciousness is something like a system ability to detect its own existence. But how can ordinary matter, arranged in a certain way, suddenly give rise to subjective experience? The renowned physicist and mathematician Roger Penrose, in his book The Emperor New Mind, writes, It seems to me that much of the brain activity is algorithmic. I firmly believe in the power of natural selection, but I do not understand how natural selection can create algorithms that possess, in some sense, a conscious evaluation of other, already existing algorithms. If you can dismiss the concept of God by saying, Sir, I have no need of that hypothesis, the paradox of consciousness is that it is just as elusive as the concept of God, yet it is the only thing directly accessible to you, the only thing whose existence you cannot doubt. Subjective experience is the starting point upon which all human knowledge of the world is built, yet all human knowledge of the world cannot explain subjective experience. As Schopenhauer wrote in his magnum opus, what knows all things, but is known by none, that is the subject. How can an organ weighing 1.5 kilograms generate the feeling of being alive? Consciousness is an anomalous phenomenon, utterly unlike any other in the natural world. In 1989, psychologist and writer Stuart Sutherland noted in the International Dictionary of Psychology, consciousness is fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to define what it is, what it does, or what it evolved. You might say, but consciousness gives us an evolutionary advantage. If so, it's entirely unclear what that advantage is. All your cognitive processes could easily occur in the dark. In 1987, Kenneth Park left his home in a Toronto suburb, got into his car, and drove 23 kilometers to his in-law's house. He got out of the car, took a tire iron from the trunk, opened the door with his key, strangled his father-in-law Dennis Woods, and beat his mother-in-law Barbara Woods before stabbing her to death with a kitchen knife. Then he got back into his car and woke up. Kenneth Park was a hereditary sleepwalker. Expert analysis showed that he experienced unusually deep sleep. Parks was acquitted. As you can see, complex cognitive functions don't necessarily require consciousness. One day, we will create robots with behavior indistinguishable from humans. These robots will analyze their surroundings, make predictions, converse, and perhaps even express emotions. But you're not gonna say they have consciousness like you. Or would you? In 1950, English mathematician, logician, and cryptographer who has had invaluable impact on the development of computer science, Alan Turing, began his prophetic paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, with the question, can machines think? He goes on to write that in order to answer this question, we first need to define what a machine is, what it means to think. But since we don't have strict definitions for either, he suggests replacing the question, can machines think, with, can machines do what we can do as thinking beings? After this, he describes a test designed to answer this question. Today, this test is known as the Turing test. You've probably heard of it. But in short, the test is considered successfully passed by a machine if a human, communicating with it, for example via text messages, cannot tell that they're interacting with a computer. The problem with the test is that it cannot tell us whether the machine has subjective experience, whether it is aware of its existence. After all, a machine can imitate thinking without actually thinking. But first of all, Turing did not set out to detect the presence of elusive consciousness in the machines. Moreover, he himself did not call his test the Turing test. He called it the imitation game, which somewhat ambiguously hints at its nature. Secondly, in response to such criticism, Turing reminds us that the question of consciousness is very poorly formulated. Moreover, in everyday life, we never have direct proof of the inner states of other people. We simply politely agree that all people think. So why should we set a higher standard for machines? And thirdly, in his work Turing writes, I do not wish to give the impression that I think there is no mystery about consciousness. There is, for instance, something of a paradox connected with any attempt to localize it. But I do not think these mysteries necessarily need to be solved before we can answer the question with which this work is concerned. So, can machines have consciousness? Well, you could also be called a machine. Of course, you weren't created in a factory, but there is no physical limitation preventing someone from going outside, gathering the necessary items, and constructing a human from them. Would such a human have consciousness? Or consider this, each individual neuron in your brain is nothing special. It is made of the same elements as the rest of the universe and obeys the same physical laws. If we started replacing each neuron in your head with a high-tech artificial equivalent, would you gradually lose your sense of self? The concept of multiple realizability is the thesis that any mental state, including consciousness, can be realized on different material substrates. What if I were disassembled into atoms and immediately reassembled? Would I still be me, or would I be someone else? The problem of personal identity is a philosophical issue. Does a person consider themselves the same individual over time, even though their body and consciousness are constantly changing? It is widely accepted in modern philosophy of consciousness that the best formulation of what consciousness is was given by the American philosopher Thomas Nagel. In 1974, in the journal Philosophical Review, he posed the most famous question in contemporary consciousness studies. What is it like to be a bat? You know perfectly well what it's like to see, hear, or touch the world around you. But you, unlike a bat, fundamentally lack the experience of exploring the world through echolocation. According to Nagel, a being can possess consciousness only if there is something it is like to be that being. That is, if the world is perceived from that being's subjective, first-person perspective. Look, do you know what this is? These are the physical properties of the color red. But as one of the founders of quantum mechanics, Erwin Schrödinger, said, the sensation of color cannot be accounted for by the physicist's objective picture of light waves. So, you can write a doctoral thesis on the physical properties of the color red, but you won't find a single word to explain to someone with protanopia what it's like to experience red. The same goes for consciousness. We can neither describe it nor prove its existence. Many believe that we cannot design an experiment that will demonstrate whether consciousness is capable of influencing the external world in any way. You are influenced by physical causes, you react. These causes can be external or internal, sometimes visible and sometimes not. As Schopenhauer said, a man can do what he wants, but not want what he wants. The theory that consciousness is a kind of byproduct of internal physical and biochemical processes is called epiphenomenalism. A simple example. It's not fear that causes a surge of adrenaline and a racing heart. No, it's the surge of adrenaline and the racing heart that are experienced as the feeling of fear. Fear is a byproduct, the epiphenomenon. This is why some people believe that the concept of consciousness should be abandoned, just as the concept of the Isa was abandoned in its time. Now, let me show you a person who claims to have no inner self. At least, he insists on this himself. This is the American philosopher and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett. In his 1991 book Consciousness Explained, Dennett attempts to prove that consciousness consists of multiple streams of information that compete for access to the brain and this way govern human behavior. The explanation of human consciousness proposed by Dennett has no fundamental difference from explaining the behavior of a complex but unconscious robot controlled by pre-programmed algorithms. Many would like it to be that simple. It would immediately solve the problem of the non-derivability of consciousness from physical processes. But then, in 1993, the Australian mathematician and philosopher David Chalmers enters the stage with his doctoral dissertation, in which he introduced the term the hard problem of consciousness. Even after we explain the physical and computational functioning of a conscious system using traditional methods from neuroscience and cognitive science, we still have to explain why this system possesses conscious experience. In other words, you can try as much as you want to derive a theory of consciousness through electrochemical processes, the work of the prefrontal cortex or quantum effects in the brain microtubules. You can talk about how Broca's area is responsible for speech, the cerebellum for coordination, the amygdala for emotions, and the occipital lobe for vision. But none of this explains why, at this very moment, something is aware of the reflection of its physical shell on the surface of a black screen. Well, if your screen isn't mad and if you're actually watching this and not just listening to the video. If you haven't read Harry Potter and Methods of Rationality, then close this pseudo-intellectual ramble and go read it. That's where true enjoyment lies. If you've read it, then you know the author, Eliezer Yudkowsky. He is a specialist in artificial intelligence, and naturally, he is interested in the problems of consciousness. In his article Zombies, he writes that it's possible to imagine your double, someone who has the same behavior, speech, and brain as you. Even every atom and quark in their body would be in the same position as yours. They would be completely identical to you, with one exception: they would have no consciousness. This is the so-called philosophical zombie, and the possibility of a world populated by such zombies is acknowledged by a significant portion, if not the majority, of academic philosophers of consciousness. In his article, Yudkowsky writes, "You are not the one who speaks your thoughts, you are the one who hears them." In the case of a zombie, thoughts are spoken in their head, but there is no one to hear them. Thus, if we assume that consciousness exists and that philosophical zombies are possible, we must conclude that consciousness does not interact with physical reality at all. From this, it follows that consciousness is a non-physical property. This line of reasoning leads to many interesting implications, such as the idea that we live in a simulation, but common sense suggests that, most likely, one of the premises is false. Yudkowsky, for example, argues that the zombie argument is complete nonsense, because no zombie would ever write articles about consciousness, let alone argue about it. Someone might say, all of this is just philosophy, as if that's a bad thing. You can't dismiss a problem just because it's philosophical. Galileo Galilei, Robert Hooke, Isaac Newton, they all consider themselves philosophers because, at the time, the problems of space and time were philosophical. But by developing general principles of systematic, mathematical and empirical approaches to solve these problems, these questions evolved into a separate field of knowledge called physics. This is the essence of philosophy. It deals with difficult problems that cannot yet be addressed separately. And yes, questions about what is scientific and what is not also fall under the domain of philosophy. It is the philosophy that defines concepts, boundaries, and the methodology. David Chalmers is the one who introduced the term the hard problem of consciousness, so David Chalmers is not some random eccentric. He is one of the most influential philosophers of our time. His book, The Conscious Mind in Search of a Fundamental Theory, caused a real sensation in its time. Almost everyone who writes books on consciousness in recent decades references it. Recently, Chalmers was invited to the 17th Isaac Asimov Memorial Conference on the topic Is our universe a computer simulation? According to him, he would like to remain a materialist scientist, but at the same time, Chalmers believes that over the centuries, we have not made the slightest progress in the understanding the phenomenon of consciousness because our ideas have not been radical or even crazy enough. To integrate consciousness into science, given its properties, we need precisely such ideas. Ideas must be as bold as the idea that the sun does not revolve around the earth, or that time is relative, or that a cat can be both alive and dead at the same time. Based on knowledge we have today, we can conclude that our world is quite absurd. So why should the nature of consciousness be any different? In his search for a theory, Chalmers proposed an absolutely extravagant idea. Since any attempt to explain consciousness in physical terms lead to the hard problem, and since consciousness cannot be reduced to the basic properties of matter, then consciousness itself is a fundamental property. It is an elementary property of our universe, manifesting in everything, but in humans, due to their complexity, it manifests in most of all. The perspective that the conscious aspect is a fundamental feature of reality is called panpsychism. Schrödinger wrote, "The reason why our sentient, percipient and thinking ego is met nowhere within our scientific world picture can easily be indicated in 7 words, because it is itself that world picture. It is identical with the whole and therefore cannot be contained in it as a part of it." Yes, we have physics and mathematics, theories and an extensive experimental foundation. Perhaps one day we will study every conceivable aspect of physical reality and derive all the formulas. But in the conclusion of his A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking writes, even if there is only one possible unified theory, it is just a set of rules and equations. What breathes fire into the equations and creates a universe that they can describe? The traditional scientific approach, which consists of building mathematical models, cannot answer the question, why should the universe described by the models exist at all? Why does the universe even bother to exist? Is it possible that by asking the question, what is consciousness, we are starting from the wrong place? Is it possible that the hard problem of consciousness stems from the hard problem of matter? Thank you for watching.